The thunder rolled across the vast Arizona sky as Grace Zimmerman stumbled down from the stagecoach, her trembling hands clutching a worn leather satchel, all that remained of her former life in Boston. Dust swirled around her ankles as she surveyed the main street of Gila Bend, a forgotten outpost that seemed more mirage than town in the sweltering heat of 1876. This remote corner of the Arizona Territory wasn't where she had planned to rebuild her shattered life, but fate had left her little choice after the doctor's devastating diagnosis back east. "Madam, you need some assistance." A deep voice cut through her thoughts. Grace turned to find herself looking up at the most striking man she'd ever encountered. Tall and broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of the desert sky at dusk, he stood beside a magnificent chestnut stallion. His weathered Stetson was pulled low, but she caught the glint of curiosity in his gaze. "I'm quite all right, thank you," she replied, straightening her spine despite the exhaustion that threatened to buckle her knees. Her gloved hand brushed a stray auburn curl from her face. "You don't look all right. No offense intended." The stranger's mouth curved slightly beneath his neatly trimmed mustache. "Name's Ross Layton. Own the Diamond L Ranch outside of town." He extended a calloused hand. Grace hesitated before accepting the handshake, feeling something unexpected pass between them. "Grace Zimmerman," she offered, then quickly added, "I've come to take possession of my uncle's mercantile, Henry Zimmerman." Recognition flashed in Ross's eyes. "Henry was your uncle. My condolences, madam, fine man. Whole town felt his loss." "Thank you," Grace replied softly. "I received word of his passing 3 weeks ago. I'm his only living relative." Ross nodded, then glanced at her bags. "Town's boarding house is full up with railroad surveyors. Got rooms above the mercantile, though, if I recall." Grace swallowed hard. Uncle Henry's letters had mentioned the accommodations, but the reality of sleeping in a dead man's home made her stomach clench. "Yes, I believe so." "Let me help you get settled," Ross offered, already gathering her luggage. "Least I can do for Henry's kin." Grace wanted to refuse, to maintain the careful distance she'd promised herself on the journey west. Getting close to anyone, especially an undeniably handsome cowboy, wasn't part of her plan. The doctor's words still echoed in her mind. The fever left too much damage. "You'll never bear children, Miss Zimmerman." At 26, those words had devastated her more profoundly than losing her teaching position or her fiancé's subsequent abandonment. "I wouldn't want to trouble you, Mr. Layton," she protested. "No trouble." His smile revealed a dimple in his right cheek. "And it's Ross." As they walked toward the mercantile, Grace felt the curious stares of townspeople. A woman alone in the West was an oddity, and she squared her shoulders against their scrutiny. The mercantile was larger than she expected, a 2-story clapboard building with a broad porch and hand-painted sign. The interior smelled of coffee, leather, and dust. Shelves lined with goods stretched from floor to ceiling, while barrels of flour, sugar, and coffee beans stood in neat rows. "Your uncle kept a good store," Ross remarked, setting her bags near the staircase that led to the second floor. "Folks depended on him." Grace ran her fingertips along the smooth counter, trying to imagine Uncle Henry standing behind it. They'd met only twice when she was a child, but his letters over the years had been kind. "Do you know who's been running it since his passing? Widow Holloway comes by most mornings to open up. Sheriff keeps the keys overnight." Ross removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair with a hint of silver at the temples. "Town needs this place. Most folks can't make the journey to Tucson for supplies." The weight of responsibility settled heavier on Grace's shoulders. She'd come to Arizona intending to sell the mercantile and move on, perhaps to San Francisco, where a woman alone might find respectable work. Now, Looking at the well-stocked shelves and remembering her uncle's pride in his establishment, she wasn't so certain. "I'll need to take inventory," she murmured, more to herself than to Ross. "Got a ledger in the drawer there," he pointed. Henry was meticulous with his bookkeeping. Grace found the leather-bound ledger and flipped it open to neat columns of figures. "You seem to know a lot about my uncle's business, Mr. Layton." "Ross," he corrected again. "And ranching brings me to town regular-like. Diamond Elticus, one of the biggest spreads in the territory. Your uncle and I did plenty of business." She nodded, suddenly aware of how close he stood, the scent of leather and sun-warmed skin making her pulse quicken unexpectedly. "I appreciate your help, Ross, but I should get settled now." Understanding crossed his features. "Course. Town saloon serves decent meals if you don't feel like cooking tonight. Or Mrs. Diaz at the end of the street makes the best tortillas this side of the Mexican border." "Thank you," Grace said, moving toward the door in clear dismissal. Ross settled his hat back on his head. "I'll be back tomorrow with some beef. Your uncle usually stocked it for the miners who come through on Saturdays." Before she could protest that she hadn't decided to stay, he was gone, boots echoing on the wooden sidewalk outside. Grace exhaled slowly, then locked the door behind him. Alone at last, she allowed her careful composure to crumble as tears slid down her cheeks. She hadn't expected kindness in this dusty frontier town. Nor had she expected the instant, unwelcome attraction to a man who would surely want the one thing she could never provide: a family. The living quarters above the Mercantile were surprisingly comfortable. 2 bedrooms, a sitting area, and a small kitchen with a cast-iron stove. Uncle Henry had furnished the space with sturdy, practical pieces, but Grace noticed feminine touches: a crocheted doily on the sideboard, curtains with tiny embroidered flowers that suggested a woman's influence at some point. After unpacking her meager belongings, Grace washed away the travel dust and changed into a simple blue calico dress. She spent the remaining daylight hours exploring the Mercantile, familiarizing herself with its inventory and organization. The more she discovered, the more impressed she became with her uncle's business acumen. When hunger finally drove her outside, the sun was setting, painting the desert landscape in fiery hues. She chose Mrs. Diaz's recommendation and soon found herself seated at a small table, savoring flavorful beans, tender beef, and the promised tortillas. "You must be Henry's niece," the petite Mexican woman said warmly, refilling Grace's water glass. "He spoke of you often." "Did he?" Grace asked, surprised. "I haven't seen him since I was a child." Mrs. Diaz nodded. "He kept your letters in a box on his mantel, very proud of his schoolteacher niece in Boston." The revelation tightened Grace's throat. She'd written dutifully over the years, describing her teaching position at the girls' seminary, her engagement to fellow teacher Edward Thornton, and later, vaguely, about her illness. She'd never mentioned Edward's abandonment after learning she couldn't have children. "Your uncle was a good man," Mrs. Diaz continued, "very respected. When he took sick, the whole town helped look after him." "I'm grateful he wasn't alone," Grace managed, the Layton boy especially. "Brought Henry to his ranch when the fever got bad, had his housekeeper tend him. Doctor came all the way from Tucson, but—" Mrs. Diaz crossed herself. God had other plans. Grace absorbed this information silently. Ross Layton hadn't mentioned caring for her uncle in his final days. Later, as she prepared for bed in the unfamiliar room, Grace pondered her situation. The Mercantile was clearly vital to Gila Bend. Could she really sell it and move on as she'd planned? And what of Ross Layton, whose kindness toward her uncle stirred unexpected warmth in a heart she'd thought thoroughly chilled by disappointment? Morning arrived with blinding desert sunlight and the sounds of Gila Bend coming to life. Grace dressed quickly in a practical brown skirt and white shirtwaist, pinning her auburn hair in a simple knot. After a light breakfast, she ventured downstairs to open the mercantile. She was arranging items on the counter when a sharp knock sounded. Through the window, she glimpsed Ross Layton's broad shoulders. Taking a deep breath, she turned the key in the lock. "Morning," he greeted, stepping inside with a wooden crate. "Brought that beef I mentioned. And some fresh eggs from my hens." "That's very kind," Grace replied, watching as he placed the crate on the counter. His movements were fluid and efficient, betraying the physical strength that ranch work required. "What do I owe you?" Ross waved off her question. "Consider it a welcome gift." "Getting settled in all right?" "Yes, thank you." She busied herself examining the contents of the crate, avoiding his penetrating gaze. "Mrs. Diaz mentioned you cared for my uncle during his illness. I'm grateful." A shadow crossed Ross's face. "Wish I could have done more." "Henry was like family to many of us." "He never married?" Grace asked, realizing how little she truly knew about her uncle's life. "No, though not for lack of interested parties." A hint of amusement softened his features. "There was talk years back about him and the widow Holloway, but nothing came of it." Grace nodded, filing away this glimpse into her uncle's past. "Will Mrs. Holloway be by today? I'd like to thank her for keeping the store open." "Expect she'll be along shortly. Saturday's a busy day here." Ross gestured toward the door. "Miners come down from the hills. Ranch hands ride in for supplies. You might want an extra pair of hands." As if on cue, the bell above the door jingled, announcing the arrival of a stout, gray-haired woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. "You must be Grace," she declared, crossing the room with surprising speed for her size. "Martha Holloway. I've been keeping your uncle's establishment from falling to ruin." Her tone was matter-of-fact but not unkind. "I appreciate your efforts, Mrs. Holloway," Grace replied, extending her hand. "I hope you'll continue to help while I learn the business." The older woman's eyebrows rose in evident surprise. "You're planning to stay then? Most of us figured you'd sell up and head back east." Grace hesitated. "I haven't made any permanent decisions, but I'd like to understand what my uncle built before deciding its fate." Mrs. Holloway nodded approvingly. "Sensible approach. Henry would be pleased." She turned to Ross with a knowing smile. "And I see you've already met our most eligible bachelor." Ross's sun-bronzed complexion couldn't quite hide his flush. "Martha, don't start that nonsense. I'm just being neighborly." "Of course you are, dear," Mrs. Holloway replied with a wink at Grace. "Now let's get this store ready for business. Saturday waits for no one." The older woman's prediction proved accurate. By mid-morning, the mercantile was bustling with customers, weathered miners with gold dust to trade, ranch hands purchasing tobacco and ammunition, and town women selecting fabrics and household necessities. Grace found herself grateful for Mrs. Holloway's efficient assistance and encyclopedic knowledge of inventory and pricing. Ross Layton departed after helping unload several heavy barrels, but not before securing Grace's promise to join him for supper the following evening. "My housekeeper makes a Sunday roast that'll make you forget all about Boston cooking," he insisted. Grace agreed before she could think better of it, telling herself it was merely neighborly to accept. Yet as the day progressed, she found her thoughts returning to his invitation with a mixture of anticipation and dread. By closing time, Grace was exhausted but exhilarated. The day's receipts exceeded her expectations, and she'd begun to understand why her uncle had found satisfaction in this remote outpost. The mercantile wasn't merely a business, it was the lifeblood of the community, a gathering place where news was exchanged, friendships maintained, and the harsh reality of frontier life made a little more bearable. "You did well today," Mrs. Holloway commented as they counted the day's earnings. "Henry would be proud." "I was a teacher, not a shopkeeper," Grace demurred. "Teaching's good preparation for almost anything," the widow replied. "You learn to read people, manage chaos, and stay calm when everything's falling apart around you." Grace laughed softly. "That's an apt description of my former classroom. Mind if I ask what brought you west? Besides Henry's passing, of course." Mrs. Holloway's direct gaze suggested she wouldn't be satisfied with evasion. Grace considered her response carefully. "My position at the seminary ended, and I found myself at a crossroads. Uncle Henry's letter arrived at precisely the right moment. It wasn't the whole truth, but neither was it a lie." Grace had indeed lost her teaching position, not because of any failing on her part, but because Edward Thornton, her fiancé and fellow teacher, had spread rumors about her delicate condition after breaking their engagement. The school's board, concerned about potential scandal, had regretfully requested her resignation. "Life has a way of pointing us in unexpected directions," Mrs. Holloway observed. "I never planned to end up in Arizona territory myself. Followed my late husband out here when he got gold fever. The mining didn't pan out, but we found a home nonetheless." As Grace prepared for bed that night, she reflected on the widow's words. Perhaps Gila Bend could be more than a temporary way station in her journey. The thought both comforted and frightened her. Establishing roots meant forming connections, and connections inevitably led to questions she wasn't prepared to answer, especially from a man like Ross Layton, whose interest in her was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Sunday morning dawned clear and hot. Grace attended services at the small, whitewashed church at the edge of town, where she was introduced to what seemed like every resident of Gila Bend. The minister, Reverend Palmer, welcomed her warmly and invited her to join the Ladies' Aid Society. "We meet Wednesday afternoons," his wife explained. "Primarily to gossip, though we pretend it's for charitable works." Her conspiratorial smile made Grace laugh. After church, Grace returned to the Mercantile to change for her dinner at the Diamond El Ranch. She selected her finest dress, a forest green poplin with modest bustle and lace trim at collar and cuffs. The color brought out the auburn highlights in her hair and complemented her fair complexion. Ross arrived promptly at 3 o'clock, driving a smart buggy pulled by a matched pair of bays. He traded his usual ranch attire for a clean white shirt, dark waistcoat, and polished boots. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he'd trimmed his mustache. The sight of him, standing on the boardwalk with hat in hand, made Grace's heart flutter treacherously. "You look lovely, Miss Zimmerman," he said, helping her into the buggy. "Please call me Grace," she replied. "After all, I'm using your given name." His smile revealed that appealing dimple again. "Grace it is, then." The journey to the Diamond L took nearly an hour, during which Ross pointed out landmarks and shared stories of the area's history. The terrain gradually changed from flat desert to rolling hills dotted with mesquite and palo verde trees. Cattle grazed in the distance, and twice they spotted pronghorn antelope bounding across the landscape. "It's beautiful in its own way," Grace admitted, watching a red-tailed hawk soar overhead. "Different from New England, but no less magnificent." "Takes some getting used to," Ross agreed. "But once the desert gets in your blood, no other place quite compares." The ranch house came into view as they crested a small rise, a sprawling, single-story structure built of adobe and timber, with a wide veranda wrapping around 3 sides. Outbuildings and corrals stretched behind it, while a windmill turned lazily beside a water tank. "This is impressive," Grace remarked. "You've built quite an operation." "Started with 20 acres and 12 head of cattle," Ross explained. That was 15 years ago, just after the war between the states. Now we're running close to 2,000 head on 40,000 acres. You achieved this alone? She asked. A shadow crossed his face. Had a partner once. My brother Robert. Lost him to Apache raiders in '68. I'm sorry, Grace said softly. Ross nodded his acknowledgement. Been on my own since, though I've got good men working for me. 20 ranch hands foreman and Mrs. Perez, who keeps us all fed and the house in order. As if summoned by her name, a stout Mexican woman emerged from the house as they approached. Senor Ross, you are late. The roast will be overdone. Her tone was scolding, but her expression was fond. Mrs. Perez, this is Miss Grace Zimmerman, Henry's niece. Ross introduced them as he helped Grace from the buggy. The housekeeper's face softened. Ah, Senor Henry's Sabrina. Welcome to Diamond L. Come inside where it is cool. The interior of the ranch house was surprisingly refined. Polished wooden floors gleamed beneath colorful Mexican rugs. The furniture was solid and well-crafted, while landscape paintings and bookshelves lined the walls. Grace noted a piano in one corner of the large front room. You play? Ross asked, following her gaze. I do, she admitted. Though it's been some time since I had access to an instrument. Perhaps you'll favor us after dinner, he suggested. It's been silent too long. Mrs. Perez served a magnificent meal, tender roast beef, vegetables from her kitchen garden, fresh baked bread, and a rich apple pie for dessert. The conversation flowed easily, with Ross sharing tales of ranch life and Grace offering glimpses of her Boston upbringing and teaching career. Why teaching? He asked as they lingered over coffee. Most women I've known either marry young or help with family businesses. I lost my parents to influenza when I was 16, Grace explained. The seminary where I was educated offered me a position after graduation. It seemed providential at the time. Ross studied her thoughtfully. And now, will you return to teaching? I'm not certain what the future holds, she replied carefully. For now, I'm content learning my uncle's business. After dinner, at Ross's urging, Grace sat at the piano. Her fingers trembled slightly as she positioned them on the keys, but muscle memory soon took over. She played a Chopin nocturne, losing herself in the haunting melody. When she finished, she realized Ross was standing beside the piano, watching her with undisguised admiration. That was beautiful, he said quietly. Thank you, she murmured, suddenly aware of how close he stood. The piano is excellently maintained. My mother's pride and joy, he explained. She insisted we haul it all the way from St. Louis when we moved west, said civilization required music. A wise woman, she was. His gaze held her steadily. She would have liked you, Grace. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibilities. Grace was the first to look away, her cheeks warming. I should probably return to town. Monday will be busy at the Mercantile. Ross nodded, though reluctance was evident in his expression. Of course. The journey back to Gila Bend was quieter, both lost in their thoughts as twilight descended over the desert. Stars emerged in the darkening sky, brilliant and countless in the clear air. Grace found herself wishing the ride would last longer, even as she reminded herself of the folly of such feelings. At the Mercantile, Ross escorted her to the door. Thank you for coming today, he said. It's been too long since the house had a woman's laughter in it. I enjoyed myself immensely, Grace replied honestly. Thank you for showing me your home. He hesitated, then reached for her hand. His touch was warm and sure as he raised her fingers to his lips in a gesture both gallant and intimate. Good night, Grace Zimmerman. Good night, Ross, she whispered, pulse racing as she hurried inside. Alone in her uncle's quarters, Grace pressed her fingertips to her lips. remembering the sensation of Ross's brief kiss. It had been proper barely more than a brushing of lips against her knuckles, yet it had affected her more profoundly than any embrace she'd shared with Edward during their courtship. "This is madness," she told herself firmly. "You came to Arizona to rebuild your life, not to lose your heart to a rancher who will expect a normal family." Yet as she prepared for bed, Grace couldn't banish the memory of Ross's smile or the warmth in his eyes as she played his mother's piano. For the first time since the doctor's devastating diagnosis, she allowed herself to wonder if there might be a different future than the solitary one she'd resigned herself to. The next few weeks established a pattern. Grace devoted herself to learning every aspect of the mercantile business, with Mrs. Holloway's steady guidance. She introduced small changes, reorganizing displays, ordering new inventory from Eastern catalogs, adding a reading corner with a selection of books and periodicals. The townspeople responded favorably, and business flourished. Ross Layton became a regular visitor, ostensibly to deliver beef and other ranch products, but his lingering presence suggested other motivations. Sometimes he brought small gifts, a particularly beautiful quartz crystal found on his property, wildflowers gathered on the ride to town, once a delicate silver hairpin purchased from a traveling peddler. Grace found herself looking forward to his visits, even as she maintained a careful distance. They developed a friendship built on shared interests and mutual respect. Ross proved to be well-read despite his frontier upbringing, and their discussions ranged from literature to politics to the changing face of the West. "The railroad will reach Tucson by year's end," he remarked one afternoon as they shared coffee on the mercantile's back porch. "Once it does, this territory will change faster than most folks realize." "For better or worse?" Grace asked. Ross considered the question seriously. "Both, I suspect. Progress brings opportunities, but also complications. The old ways, both good and bad, get swept aside. You sound like you have mixed feelings about it." "I came west for the freedom, the open spaces," he admitted. "Part of me resists seeing it tamed and parceled out. But I'm not blind to the benefits. Easier access to markets, medicine, manufactured goods. And perhaps fewer young women will find themselves stranded in remote outposts with limited prospects." Grace smiled wryly. "Are you suggesting I might have more suitors once the railroad arrives?" A flash of something possessiveness crossed his features before he masked it with a casual shrug. "Any man with sense can see your worth, railroad or no railroad." Such moments occurred with increasing frequency, charged exchanges that hinted at deeper feelings, quickly redirected by Grace's deliberate changes of subject. If Ross noticed her evasions, he was too much the gentleman to comment. June brought blistering heat to Gila Bend. The mercantile became uncomfortably warm by mid-afternoon, despite open windows and doors. Grace took to completing her bookkeeping in the relative cool of early morning, leaving afternoons for serving customers and restocking shelves. It was during one such morning, as she worked on inventory lists at the counter, that the door opened unexpectedly early. Looking up, she was startled to find not a customer but Sheriff Taylor, his weathered face grave beneath his graying mustache. "Miss Zimmerman," he began, turning his hat in his hands. "Sorry to disturb you, but we've got a situation I thought you should know about." "What is it, Sheriff?" Grace asked, setting aside her pencil. "Got word from a rider just came in from Diamond L. There's been an accident out there." Ross Layton took a bad fall while breaking a new stallion. "Doc Wilson's been sent for, but—" "How serious is it?" Grace interrupted, her heart suddenly pounding. "Don't have details, madam, but the rider seemed mighty concerned. Said Ross was unconscious when he left." Grace's mind raced. "Mrs. Holloway wouldn't arrive for another hour, and the mercantile was supposed to open at 9. Yet she couldn't bear the thought of waiting for news while measuring flour and counting change. "I need to go there," she decided aloud. "Can you arrange a horse for me?" The sheriff looked surprised. "Madam, it's a fair distance, and in this heat, I'm quite capable of riding, Sheriff, please." Something in her expression must have convinced him. "I'll have my deputy bring over a gentle mare. Can you be ready in 15 minutes? I can be ready in 5, Grace assured him. True to her word, Grace changed quickly into her simplest skirt and a lightweight blouse, pinning a wide-brimmed hat securely over her hair. She scrawled a note for Mrs. Holloway explaining her absence, locked the mercantile, and was waiting when the deputy arrived with a dappled gray mare. The ride to Diamond L was grueling in the June heat, but Grace barely noticed the discomfort. Her mind was filled with terrifying possibilities. How serious was Ross's injury? What if he died without knowing how much he'd come to mean to her? This last thought stopped her cold. When had Ross Layton become so essential to her happiness? When had her carefully constructed defenses begun to crumble? As the ranch house came into view, Grace urged the mare to a faster pace. A cluster of men stood outside the bunkhouse, while a buggy with the doctor's distinctive black bag visible on the seat was parked near the main house. Grace dismounted hastily, handing the reins to a surprised ranch hand. "Where is he?" she demanded. "In his room, madam. Doc's with him now." She hurried inside, past a startled Mrs. Perez who exclaimed, "Miss Grace! Thank the saints you have come." Grace followed the sound of voices to a bedroom at the rear of the house. The door stood partially open, revealing Dr. Wilson bending over a bed where Ross lay motionless, his face alarmingly pale against the white pillowcase. "How is he?" Grace asked from the doorway, her voice barely above a whisper. The doctor straightened, turning to regard her with mild surprise. "Miss Zimmerman, I wasn't expecting you. Please, doctor, tell me." The physician sighed. "Concussion from the fall, 3 broken ribs, internal bleeding I'm concerned about. He regained consciousness briefly, which is encouraging, but he's not out of danger yet." Grace moved closer to the bed. Ross's strong features were slack in unconsciousness, a vivid bruise darkening his left temple. A bandage was visible where his nightshirt gaped open. "What can I do?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Keep him still if he wakes," the doctor instructed. "Try to get him to take water. I've given Mrs. Perez laudanum for the pain, but use it sparingly. I need to check on a childbirth case in town, but I'll return this evening." After the doctor departed, Grace pulled a chair close to Ross's bedside. Mrs. Perez brought cool water and clean cloths, showing Grace how to bathe his face and moisten his lips. "You care for him, yes?" the housekeeper asked softly. Grace didn't bother denying it. "Yes, more than I should, perhaps." Mrs. Perez patted her shoulder. "El corazon tiene sus razones, the heart has its reasons. Senor Ross is a good man. He deserves happiness." "Everyone deserves happiness," Grace murmured, gently pressing a damp cloth to Ross's forehead. "But sometimes life has other plans." The hours passed slowly. Grace maintained her vigil, speaking softly to Ross even though he showed no sign of hearing her. She told him about Boston, about her parents, about the dreams she'd once harbored for a teaching career and family of her own. "I never expected to find anything worthwhile in Arizona," she confessed, holding his limp hand between her own. "I certainly never expected to find you." As twilight descended, Ross stirred slightly. His eyelids fluttered, then opened, revealing confusion as he tried to focus on her face. "Grace." His voice was a rough whisper. "I'm here," she assured him, relief washing through her. "Don't try to move, you've been injured." "The stallion," he mumbled, "got the better of me, so I heard. Very inconsiderate of him. A faint smile touched Ross's lips before pain contorted his features. Hurts to breathe. Broken ribs, Grace explained, reaching for the water glass. Here, try to drink a little. She supported his head as he sipped, then eased him back onto the pillows. The doctor will return soon. He left something for the pain. Ross shook his head slightly. Not yet. Want to stay awake? Why are you here? The question was direct, his gaze suddenly more focused despite his weakened state. Grace found she couldn't prevaricate. I was worried about you, she admitted. When the sheriff told me what happened, I couldn't stay in town. Rode all the way out here. There was a note of wonder in his voice. It wasn't so far, she said, though her aching muscles told a different story. Ross's hand tightened around hers. Thank you. Rest now, she urged. We can talk when you're stronger. But he seemed determined to speak. Been wanting to tell you something. Maybe now's as good a time as any, in case. Don't, Grace interrupted. You're going to recover fully. Still, he insisted. A man thinks about what's left unsaid when he's staring at the ceiling after being thrown from a horse. He paused, gathering strength. I've developed feelings for you, Grace Zimmerman, strong feelings. Grace's heart constricted painfully. Ross, please, you're injured. This isn't the time, no better time, he countered. Seeing you here, knowing you came all this way. I think maybe you might feel something too. She couldn't deny it, not with her emotions so raw and his gaze so intent upon her face. I do, she whispered, but there are things you don't know about me. Nothing that could change how I feel. You can't say that, Grace protested. You don't understand. Then help me understand, he urged. Before she could respond, footsteps in the hallway announced the doctor's return. Grace withdrew her hand from Ross's grasp and stood as Dr. Wilson entered, carrying his medical bag. Ah, conscious I see, the physician observed. Good sign, Layton. How's the pain? While the doctor examined Ross, Grace retreated to the kitchen where Mrs. Perez was preparing a simple supper. The housekeeper took one look at her face and wordlessly poured a cup of strong coffee, adding a splash of brandy from a bottle kept for medicinal purposes. Doctor says he will recover, Mrs. Perez offered after Grace had taken several sips. The bleeding has stopped. Thank God, Grace murmured. You should eat, then rest, the older woman suggested. There is a guest room prepared. I will sit with Senor Ross. Grace wanted to protest, but exhaustion was claiming her now that the immediate crisis had passed. She accepted a bowl of hearty stew and a thick slice of bread, eating mechanically before allowing Mrs. Perez to show her to a comfortable bedroom across the hall from Ross's. I'll wake you if there is any change, the housekeeper promised. Alone in the unfamiliar room, Grace removed her dusty clothes and washed with water from the porcelain pitcher and bowl on the dresser. She slipped into the nightgown Mrs. Perez had provided, likely belonging to Ross's mother or perhaps a female relative, and climbed into the high four-poster bed. Despite her fatigue, sleep proved elusive. Ross's words echoed in her mind. I've developed feelings for you. She'd suspected as much, had even begun to acknowledge her own emotions, but hearing him say it aloud made everything more real and more impossible. Eventually, sheer exhaustion claimed her. When she woke, sunlight was streaming through the window, and for a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous day rushed back, and she sat up quickly. A dress was draped over a chair, one of her own from the mercantile, she realized with surprise. A note in Mrs. Holloway's distinctive handwriting explained that she had brought a few necessities for Grace, anticipating a longer stay at Diamond L. Dressing quickly, Grace went to check on Ross. She found him propped against pillows, pale but alert, while Mrs. Perez coaxed him to eat broth. You look better, Grace observed from the doorway. Ross's face brightened at the sight of her. Doc says I'm too stubborn to die. A quality I can appreciate, she replied, moving into the room. Mrs. Perez took the opportunity to depart with the half-empty soup bowl, giving Grace a meaningful glance as she passed. "She tells me you stayed by my side all yesterday," Ross said once they were alone. "I don't remember much after our conversation." "The laudanum," Grace explained. "Dr. Wilson said you needed rest. And did you rest?" She nodded. Mrs. Perez insisted. She can be persuasive. His smile faded, replaced by a more serious expression. "About what I said yesterday, I meant it, Grace. These past weeks, getting to know you, I've never felt this way about anyone." Grace looked down at her clasped hands. "Ross, please, you're still recovering." "My head's clear enough," he insisted. "And I'd like to know what you meant when you said there were things I don't know about you." She'd hoped he might have forgotten that part of their exchange. Taking a deep breath, Grace moved to the window, gathering courage as she gazed out at the sun-drenched landscape. "2 years ago, I became ill with rheumatic fever," she began quietly. "It was a severe case. For a time, the doctors didn't think I would survive." "Grace, I'm sorry," Ross said softly. "I recovered eventually, but there was damage." She forced herself to continue. "The doctors discovered the fever had affected my reproductive organs. They told me I would never be able to bear children." The admission hung in the air between them. Grace kept her back to Ross, unable to face his reaction. When he remained silent, she continued, her voice tight with suppressed emotion. "I was engaged at the time. Edward, my fiancé, was initially sympathetic. But eventually he decided he couldn't marry a woman who couldn't give him heirs." She gave a bitter laugh. "He was quite direct about it, said it wouldn't be fair to either of us." "He sounds like a fool," Ross said finally. Grace turned in surprise. "Pardon?" "A damn fool," Ross repeated, color rising in his face. "To throw away a chance at happiness with a woman like you over something neither of you could control." "But you don't understand," Grace protested. "A man wants children, a family, a man wants a partner," Ross interrupted. "Someone to share his life, his dreams. Children are a blessing, yes, but they're not the only measure of a marriage's worth." Grace stared at him, scarcely able to believe what she was hearing. "You say that now, but I say it knowing exactly what it means," he said firmly. "Grace, I lost my parents, my brother. I know the value of family, but I also know that family is what we make it, not just what we're born into." His sincerity was unmistakable, yet Grace had built her defenses too carefully to surrender them so easily. "You should rest," she said. "We can discuss this when you're fully recovered." Ross looked like he wanted to argue, but weariness was evident in his drawn features. "Promise me you won't disappear back to town without saying goodbye." "I promise," she assured him. The next few days established a new routine. Grace divided her time between the ranch and the mercantile, riding into town each morning to open the store with Mrs. Holloway, then returning to Diamond L in the late afternoon. Ross improved steadily, his natural vitality reasserting itself as the pain in his ribs subsided and the concussion symptoms faded. By the end of the week, he was able to sit on the veranda, watching the ranch operations from a distance while chafing at his enforced inactivity. Grace often joined him after supper, the two of them sharing the day's events as the desert sunset painted the sky in spectacular hues. They didn't return to the subject of Grace's revelation, though she sensed Ross was simply biding his time. For her part, she found herself both dreading and anticipating the conversation they would eventually need to have. One evening, as they sat watching a distant lightning storm illuminate the mountains, Ross broke the comfortable silence. "Doc Wilson says I can start light duties next week. No riding yet, but I can manage paperwork and such." "That's wonderful," Grace said sincerely. I know how difficult this confinement has been for you." "Hasn't been all bad," he replied, his gaze warm as it rested on her face. "Given me time to think, make some decisions." Grace's pulse quickened. "Oh, been thinking about what you told me, about not being able to have children." He spoke carefully, as if testing each word. "Wanted you to know it doesn't change how I feel about you." "Ross, let me finish," he requested gently. "I need to say this while I've got it straight in my head." Grace nodded, her throat too tight for words. "I won't pretend I never thought about having children someday," Ross continued. "But life out here teaches you that plans don't always work out the way you expect. You adapt or you break." He reached for her hand, his calloused fingers warm against hers. "What I feel for you is real, Grace. More real than some idea of what a family should look like. And there are children who need homes, need love. If that's something you'd want someday." Tears blurred Grace's vision. "You've thought about this." "Had plenty of time to think lately," he said with a wry smile. "But mostly I've been thinking about how empty this place felt before you came into my life, and how I don't want to go back to that." "What are you saying?" Grace whispered, though she knew the answer. Ross's expression grew serious. "I'm saying I love you, Grace Zimmerman, and if you'll have me, I'd like to court you properly, with the intention of making you my wife." The words she'd both longed for and feared hung in the air between them. Grace looked into his steady blue eyes and saw nothing but sincerity and love reflected there. "I love you too," she admitted, the confession both terrifying and liberating. "But I'm afraid that someday you'll regret choosing a woman who can't give you children of your own blood." "The only thing I'd regret is losing you," Ross said firmly. "The rest we'll figure out together." He leaned forward, wincing slightly at the movement, and brushed his lips gently against hers. The kiss was brief but perfect, a promise, a beginning. As summer gave way to autumn, Ross's courtship of Grace became the talk of Gila Bend. He called at the mercantile daily when his ranch duties allowed, bringing small gifts and taking her for drives in his buggy. They attended church together on Sundays, followed by dinner either at Diamond L or with friends in town. Grace found herself blossoming under Ross's steady affection. The shadow that had followed her since the doctor's devastating diagnosis began to recede, replaced by a cautious hope for the future. She threw herself into the mercantile business with renewed purpose, implementing improvements that increased both inventory and profits. In October, Ross formally proposed, presenting her with his mother's engagement ring, a delicate gold band set with a small but perfect diamond. They planned a December wedding, to be held in the town church with Reverend Palmer officiating. Nothing extravagant, Grace insisted when Mrs. Holloway and other town ladies began suggesting elaborate arrangements. Something simple and meaningful. "But it's the social event of the year," Mrs. Diaz protested. "The most eligible bachelor in the territory finally marrying." Grace stood firm, however, and Ross supported her preference for a modest ceremony. What mattered to both of them was the commitment they were making, not the trappings surrounding it. As the wedding approached, Grace divided her attention between preparations and training a young couple, the Harrises, to manage the mercantile. She had decided to maintain ownership of the store while moving to Diamond L after the wedding, with the Harrises operating it day to day in exchange for the living quarters and a percentage of profits. "Uncle Henry would approve, I think," she told Ross as they discussed the arrangement. "The store stays in the family but serves the community." "He'd be proud of what you've accomplished," Ross agreed. "I know I am." The wedding day dawned clear and crisp, with a dusting of frost silvering the desert plants. Grace, dressed in a gown of ivory silk, simple but elegant, with her auburn hair arranged in a coronet of small white flowers. Mrs. Holloway helped her prepare, clucking approvingly as she adjusted the veil. "Never seen a more beautiful bride," the older woman declared, blinking back tears. "Nor one more deserving of happiness." The church was filled to capacity, with townspeople and ranch hands alike dressed in their Sunday best. As Grace walked down the aisle on Sheriff Taylor's arm, he had volunteered to give her away. She saw only Ross waiting at the altar, his expression a mixture of pride, joy, and unmistakable love. Their vows were traditional but spoken with deep conviction. When Reverend Palmer pronounced them husband and wife, Ross's kiss was both tender and passionate, a public declaration of his feelings that brought cheers from the assembled guests. The celebration afterward, held at the town hall, lasted well into the evening. There was music, dancing, and enough food to feed half the territory. Grace found herself passed from one well-wisher to another, her cheeks flushed with happiness and perhaps a bit more champagne than she was accustomed to. Ready to escape. Ross whispered in her ear as the festivities continued around them. Grace nodded, suddenly eager for privacy. They slipped away amid knowing smiles and good-natured teasing, climbing into the waiting buggy for the journey to Diamond L, her new home. That night, as they lay in each other's arms, Grace experienced a healing she hadn't known she needed. Ross's love, expressed in whispered words and gentle touches, began to mend the wounds left by rejection and loss. For the first time since her illness, she felt whole again, valued for herself rather than for what she could or couldn't provide. The months that followed were among the happiest of Grace's life. She adapted quickly to ranch life, learning to manage the household while still making weekly trips to town to check on the mercantile. She and Ross settled into a partnership that transcended traditional roles, with him seeking her opinion on ranch matters and her consulting him about business decisions. Spring arrived, bringing new calves to the ranch and increased activity as the cattle drive season approached. One evening in late April, as they sat on the veranda after dinner, Grace broached a subject that had been on her mind. "I've been thinking about what you said before we married," she began carefully, "about children who need homes." Ross's expression grew attentive. "What about it?" "There's a situation in town. The Millers, Thomas was killed in that mining accident in February." At Ross's nod, she continued. "His widow is struggling with consumption. The doctor doesn't think she'll last the summer, and there are the 3 children to consider." "No relatives to take them," Grace shook her head. "None that Mrs. Miller knows of. She's been asking around town, trying to find homes for them before." She couldn't finish the sentence. Ross was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "How old are they?" "William is 10, Mary is 7, and little James just turned 4, Grace replied, her heart beating faster at his implied interest. "They're good children, Ross. Well-behaved despite everything they've been through." He turned to look at her, his expression softening at the hope he must have seen in her face. "You've already grown attached to them, haven't you?" "I've been bringing supplies from the mercantile, helping where I can," she admitted. "They're so brave, Ross, especially William. He tries so hard to be the man of the family." Ross reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Would be a shame to separate siblings." "It would," Grace agreed, hardly daring to hope. "Ranch could use another pair of hands in a few years," Ross continued thoughtfully. "And that big bedroom off the kitchen is just gathering dust." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying let's meet these children properly," Ross replied, his voice rough with emotion. "See if they might want to come live at Diamond L. Be part of our family." The meeting was arranged for the following Sunday. Grace was a bundle of nerves as she and Ross visited the small cabin where the Miller family lived. Mrs. Miller, pale and thin, but determined to see her children's future secured, welcomed them warmly. William, a serious boy with his father's sandy hair, regarded Ross with cautious interest, especially when the rancher spoke of horses and cattle. Mary, shy at first, gradually warmed to Grace's gentle questions about her rag doll. Little James, too young to fully understand the situation, was simply delighted by the peppermint sticks Ross had brought. "They seem like fine children, Mrs. Miller," Ross said as they prepared to leave. "My wife and I would be honored to welcome them to our home if that's something you'd consider." The dying woman's eyes filled with tears. "You'd take all three, keep them together." "We wouldn't dream of separating them," Grace assured her, reaching for her hand. "They'd have a good home with us, I promise. Education, plenty to eat, and all the love we can give them." Mrs. Miller's relief was palpable. "I've been praying for an answer," she whispered. "Seems like my prayers have been heard." The legal arrangements were made with Sheriff Taylor's assistance. By early June, with Mrs. Miller's condition deteriorating rapidly, the children moved to Diamond L. The transition wasn't without challenges. William, in particular, struggled with the loss of his mother and the move to an unfamiliar home, but gradually, a new family dynamic began to emerge. Ross proved to be a natural father, patient and understanding but firm when necessary. He took William under his wing, teaching him about ranch operations and treating his questions with respect. Mary appointed herself Grace's assistant, following her around the house and eagerly helping with simple chores. James, the youngest, brought laughter back to rooms that had been silent too long. When word came in late July of Mrs. Miller's passing, they mourned together. Ross and Grace took the children to the funeral, standing with them as a family as the town paid its respects to a woman who had faced her final days with remarkable courage. "She's with Papa now," Mary said as they returned to the ranch, her small hand clutched in Grace's. "In heaven." "Yes, sweetheart," Grace agreed, swallowing past the lump in her throat. "And they'll always be watching over you." That night, after the children were asleep, Ross found Grace sitting on the veranda, gazing at the star-filled sky. "You've been quiet," he observed, settling beside her. "Just thinking about how life takes unexpected turns," she replied. "A year ago, I arrived in Gila Bend believing my chance for a family was gone forever. Now look at us." Ross smiled, drawing her closer. "Those kids are lucky to have you." "We're the lucky ones," Grace countered. "They've brought so much joy into our lives." "That they have," he agreed. "House feels right with children in it." Grace rested her head against his shoulder, contentment washing over her. They sat in companionable silence, listening to the night sounds of the desert and the occasional creak from the house as it cooled from the day's heat. "Ross," she said eventually. I've been feeling strange lately. Tired, and—" She hesitated, almost afraid to voice the thought that had been forming. "I'm late. My monthly cycle. It's never been regular since my illness, but it's been 6 weeks now." Ross straightened, turning to look at her. "Grace, are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I don't know," she admitted. "It seems impossible after what the doctors told me, but I've been wondering if maybe they were wrong." Hope flared in Ross's eyes, quickly tempered with concern. "Have you spoken with Doc Wilson?" "Not yet. I didn't want to say anything until I was more certain. And I didn't want to disappoint you if it's nothing." "Grace," Ross said gently, taking her face between his hands, "you could never disappoint me. We already have a family, a wonderful family. Anything more would just be an unexpected blessing." Tears welled in Grace's eyes at his unwavering support. "I love you, Ross Layton." "And I love you," he replied, kissing her softly. "Now, first thing tomorrow, we're going to see Doc Wilson." Dr. Wilson confirmed what Grace had begun to suspect against all medical predictions. She was indeed expecting a child. The doctor was cautious, warning that her previous condition might make for a difficult pregnancy, but there was no mistaking the joy in his congratulations. "Miracles do happen," he told them. "I've seen it before. Sometimes the body heals in ways science can't fully explain." As Grace's condition became more evident, the town of Gila Bend celebrated with them. Mrs. Holloway organized a quilting circle to prepare blankets for the baby. Mrs. Diaz supplied special teas and foods meant to strengthen both mother and child. Even the children embraced the news with excitement, especially Mary, who declared herself ready to be a big sister. The pregnancy progressed without the complications Dr. Wilson had feared. Grace glowed with health, her auburn hair more lustrous, her green eyes bright with anticipation. Ross hovered protectively, insisting she rest frequently and hiring additional help for the household chores. "I'm pregnant, not made of glass," Grace protested when he tried to prevent her from carrying a basket of washing. "Humor me," Ross replied, taking the basket from her hands. "I'm new to this fatherhood business." "You're a wonderful father already," she reminded him, gesturing toward where William was proudly showing James how to safely feed a carrot to one of the gentler horses. Ross followed her gaze, his expression softening. "They're good kids. Best decision we ever made bringing them here." "One of the best," Grace agreed, resting her hand on her rounded belly where their child grew against all odds. As winter settled over the Arizona territory, Grace's time drew near. Dr. Wilson moved temporarily into one of the guest rooms at Diamond L, unwilling to risk being delayed by weather when the moment arrived. Mrs. Perez prepared the nursery, bringing out the cradle that had once held Ross himself, carefully preserved in the attic. The labor began during a rare desert snowfall, delicate flakes drifting past the windows as Grace experienced her first contractions. The process was long and difficult, testing her strength and Ross's composure as he paced anxiously outside the bedroom. Shortly after midnight, a lusty cry announced the arrival of their son, a healthy, robust boy with a shock of dark hair and his father's blue eyes. "A perfect miracle," Dr. Wilson declared as he placed the swaddled infant in Grace's arms. Ross, finally admitted to the room, stood transfixed at the sight of his wife and newborn child. Tears streamed unashamedly down his face as he approached the bed. "He's beautiful," he whispered, gently touching his son's tiny hand, "just like his mother." Grace looked up at her husband, her heart so full she could barely speak. "We did it," she managed. "We really did it." "No," Ross corrected softly. "You did it. You amazing, incredible woman." He leaned down to kiss her forehead reverently. "Thank you for this gift." They named him Henry Robert Layton, honoring both Grace's uncle and Ross's brother. The children were brought in the next morning to meet their new brother, their excited whispers and wide-eyed wonder adding to the joy that filled the ranch house. As Grace nursed her son in the quiet of the nursery, Ross came to sit beside her, his expression contemplative. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "Just thanking heaven," he replied simply. "For you, for our children, all four of them, for this life we've built together." Grace smiled, understanding completely. "I never thought this would be possible," she admitted. "A family, love, this beautiful child." "You deserve every happiness," Ross told her, his voice husky with emotion. "And I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure you have it." As if in agreement, little Henry made a contented sound against his mother's breast. Outside, the snow continued to fall, transforming the desert landscape into something magical and unexpected, much like the journey that had brought Grace to this moment. This family, this love that had healed her in ways she never imagined possible. 3 years later, the Diamond L Ranch was thriving. Additional acreage had been purchased, the cattle herd expanded, and a new wing added to the ranch house to accommodate the growing Layton family. Little Henry, now a sturdy toddler with his father's charm and his mother's determination, had been joined by a sister, Elizabeth Grace, whose arrival the previous spring had been considerably easier than her brother's birth. The Miller children had truly become Laytons in all but name. William, at 13, was showing a natural aptitude for ranch management that made Ross beam with pride. Mary had blossomed into a confident 10-year-old with her adoptive mother's love of books and music. James, now 7, was the family comedian, his antics keeping everyone laughing even on the most difficult days. Grace divided her time between family responsibilities, occasional visits to the mercantile, still thriving under the Harrises' management, and her newest project, a small school for the children of Diamond L ranch hands and neighboring properties. With Reverend Palmer's blessing, she'd converted an unused outbuilding into a classroom where she taught 3 mornings each week. On a warm September afternoon, as Grace sat on the veranda nursing Elizabeth while watching Ross and the older children repairing a section of corral fence, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. The pain and loss that had once defined her life now seemed like distant shadows, eclipsed by the joy and purpose she'd found in Arizona. Ross looked up from his work, catching her eye across the yard. His smile, still capable of making her heart race after 4 years of marriage, conveyed all the love and gratitude she felt herself. Later that night, with the children asleep and the house quiet, they stood together on the veranda, watching a meteor shower paint brilliant streaks across the desert sky. "Make a wish," Grace suggested, leaning into her husband's embrace. Ross chuckled, his arms tightening around her. "Don't need to. Already have everything I could possibly wish for right here." Grace turned in his arms, rising on tiptoe to kiss him. "So do I," she whispered against his lips. "So do I." Above them, stars continued to fall, each one a testament to the miracle of love that had transformed their lives, a love that had overcome doubt, defied medical certainty, and created a family bound not just by blood, but by choice, commitment, and unwavering faith in each other.